Right now, you are standing, or sitting, somewhere on top of history. Beneath your feet, beneath the roads you drive on, beneath the buildings where you work and shop and eat, there are layers. Layers of soil, yes, but also layers of time. And in those layers, buried under centuries of dirt and stone and modern construction, are the remains of entire cities. Real cities. Places where real people lived, raised their children, ran their businesses, worshipped their gods, buried their dead, and went about their days just like you do now. This is not a fantasy. This is not a movie. This is what actually happens to civilizations. They rise, they fall, they get covered, and then, thousands of years later, someone builds a parking lot on top of them. The ground beneath our modern world is not empty. It is full. It is stuffed with the ruins of places that were once just as busy and alive as any city you know today. Some of these cities were destroyed by wars. Some were buried by earthquakes or floods or volcanic eruptions. Some were simply abandoned. And over hundreds of years, wind and rain and time buried them under layers of earth. And then people forgot they were ever there, until someone started digging. Over the last 200 years, as archaeology became a real science and as people started paying attention to what was underground, the discoveries have been staggering. We have found entire cities, with streets, buildings, temples, markets, homes, preserved under the ground beneath cities that exist today. In some cases, the modern city sitting on top of the ancient one has no idea what is directly below it. In other cases, the ancient city is so famous now, people travel from all over the world just to stand where those ancient people once stood. Today, we are going to talk about 10 of those places, 10 ancient cities that are buried beneath modern civilization, and we are going to explain each one from the very beginning in plain language so that even if you have never thought about archaeology a day in your life, by the time you are done with this, you will understand what these places are, how they were found, what they look like, and why they matter. Let us start with the basics, so you have a foundation before we get into the specific cities. Most people, when they hear the word buried, think of something being hidden on purpose, like treasure buried in the ground. But when archaeologists talk about ancient cities being buried, they usually mean something very different. These cities were not hidden on purpose. They were covered by natural processes that happened slowly over a very long period of time. Here's how it works. When a city is abandoned or destroyed, the buildings stop being maintained. Roofs collapse. Walls fall. The material from those collapsed structures, broken bricks, stone, timber, plaster, settles into piles on the ground. Then the wind blows dust and sand and soil over those piles. Rain washes more sediment. Plants grow, die, decay, and add organic material to the soil. Floods deposit layers of silt. Year by year, decade by decade, century by century, the remains of the city get buried deeper and deeper under new layers of earth. In some places, this process happens faster because of specific events. A volcanic eruption can bury a city under meters of ash in a single day. A flood can deposit thick layers of silt. A sandstorm in a desert region can bury entire structures very quickly. In other places, the process is slow and gradual. A city abandoned for 2,000 years might be buried under just a few feet of soil. But a few feet is enough to hide it from the surface entirely, especially when vegetation grows on top and makes everything look like ordinary ground. Now here is the other important thing to understand. Cities get built on top of cities. When people in ancient times came to a place that had once been settled before, they often chose to build there again, because the location was good. Maybe it was near a river, or at a crossroads of trade routes, or protected by hills. So they would clear the area, level the ground, and start building. But they were building on top of the ruins of whatever was there before. Over generations, a site could accumulate many layers. Archaeologists call these layers strata, each one representing a different period of human habitation. This is why many of the world's most important cities today sit directly on top of ancient cities. A new city is built on the same spot as the old one, for the same reasons the old one was there in the first place. Water, trade routes, defensible positions, these factors do not change. And so, beneath the subway stations and the shopping malls and the apartment buildings of major modern cities, there are entire ancient worlds waiting to be discovered. Now, let us get into the 10 cities. Let us start with one of the most famous ancient cities of all, Troy. If you have heard of the Trojan War, The story of the great battle fought over the beautiful Helen, the wooden horse full of soldiers, the Greek heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, then you already know something about Troy. For thousands of years, many people assumed this was just a myth, a story, something made up by ancient storytellers. But in the 1870s, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became obsessed with the idea that Troy was real. He had read the ancient Greek poems about the war, poems written by a man named Homer, and he believed they were describing a real place and real events. So he went looking. He went to a place in what is now the western part of Turkey, near the Aegean. There was a hill there called Hisarlik. It did not look like much, just a grassy mound rising above the flat surrounding land. But Schliemann started digging. What he found changed everything. Beneath that mound, he found not one city, but many, layer upon layer of human habitation, stacked on top of each other like the pages of a very thick book. Archaeologists who have studied the site since then have identified at least 9 major layers, each one representing a different city that was built on the spot at different times in history. The city we call Troy, or at least the most famous version of it, the one that corresponds to the period when the Trojan War might have taken place, is one of the middle layers, generally called Troy 7 by archaeologists. This layer dates to roughly 1300 to 1200 BCE, which is around 3,300 years ago. Evidence at this layer suggests the city was destroyed by fire. There are signs of warfare, bronze arrowheads, unburied human remains, hurried repairs to walls, clear evidence of battle damage. This fits very well with the stories of the Trojan War. But beneath even that layer are older cities, some going back to around 3000 BCE, that is 5,000 years ago. And above it are later cities, built by Greeks, then by Romans, then by others, right up until the site was finally abandoned in the early medieval today. The site is located in the Çanakkale province of modern Turkey. It is a national treasure and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can visit it. You can walk among the excavated ruins and see the stone walls of the ancient city rising out of the ground. The surrounding countryside is ordinary Turkish farmland, fields and hills and small villages. Nothing about the landscape suggests that one of the most famous cities in human history is right there, buried in that hill. Schliemann's methods, by the way, were quite destructive by modern standards. He dug aggressively and destroyed some layers in his rush to find what he believed was Homeric Troy. Modern archaeologists, who have continued to work at the site through the 20th century and into the 21st, have used much more careful techniques and have been able to learn far more about the site without destroying it. What Troy teaches us is that the stories people tell across generations, even stories that seem like myths, can sometimes be pointing to real places, real events, real history buried in the ground. Most people have heard of Pompeii, the Roman city destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, but fewer people know about Herculaneum, which was also destroyed in the same eruption, and which was in many ways even better preserved. Let us start with the basics. Mount Vesuvius is a volcano located in the southern part of Italy, near the city of Naples. In ancient Roman times, the area around the volcano was densely populated. It was fertile agricultural land, and the Bay of Naples was beautiful and important for people had been living there for centuries. On August 24th, in the year 79 CE, that is almost 2,000 years ago, Mount Vesuvius exploded with catastrophic force. It sent a massive column of ash, rock, and gas tens of kilometers into the sky. The city of Pompeii, located to the southeast of the volcano, was buried under meters of ash and pumice over the course of several hours. Most people know this story, but Herculaneum, which was located to the west of Vesuvius on the coast of the Bay of Naples, experienced something different and in some ways more devastating. Instead of being buried by falling ash, Herculaneum was hit by what are called pyroclastic surges, massive waves of superheated gas, ash, and rock that moved down the side of the volcano at enormous speed and temperature. These surges reached Herculaneum in the middle of the night, and the people there had almost no warning and no chance. The pyroclastic material buried Herculaneum under roughly 20 meters, about 65 feet of volcanic rock and ash. That is a very deep burial. In Pompeii, the ash layer is only about 4 to 6 meters. In Herculaneum, it is 4 to 5 times deeper. This depth is both a challenge and a blessing. It is a challenge because digging through 20 meters of what is essentially volcanic rock requires enormous effort. And the problem is compounded by the fact that a modern Italian town, Herculaneum, was built directly on top of the ancient city. The streets, buildings, homes, and infrastructure of modern Herculaneum sit right on top of Herculaneum. To fully excavate the ancient city, you would have to demolish significant portions of the modern one. That is obviously not going to happen, but the depth of the burial is also a blessing because it preserved Herculaneum remarkably well. Unlike Pompeii, where wooden structures rotted away and many organic materials were destroyed, Herculaneum's organic materials were carbonized, turned into a kind of carbon-preserved state by the intense heat of the pyroclastic surge. This means that wooden furniture, wooden beams, food, fabric, papyrus scrolls, things that virtually never survive in archaeological sites, were preserved at Herculaneum. Archaeologists working at Herculaneum have found wooden beds still standing in rooms. They have found carbonized loaves of bread still sitting in ovens. They have found a jar of olives. They have found an entire library, the only library from the ancient Greco-Roman world that survived more or less intact. It is called the Villa of the Papyri, and it contained over 1,000 papyrus scrolls. Most of them are still being slowly and painstakingly unrolled and read thousands of years after they were written. The portion of Herculaneum that has been excavated is extraordinary. You can walk down streets where Roman paving stones still carry the ruts made by cartwheels. You can look into shops and see counters where food was sold. You can enter houses with their wall paintings still vivid and bright. Some of these colors have not faded in 2,000 years because the volcanic material sealed them away from air and light. But the majority of Herculaneum is still underground, beneath the streets and buildings of modern Herculaneum. There is far more ancient city that has not been excavated. It sits there, sealed in volcanic rock. The technology to excavate it without destroying the modern city above does not yet exist in a practical form. Researchers are constantly working on new methods. Herculaneum reminds us that sometimes the thing buried underground is more complete, more vivid, and more telling than anything we have built on top of it. Now we go even further back in time, much further. Çatalhöyük is not a name most people recognize, but it is one of the most important places ever discovered for understanding where human civilization comes from. Here is the background. For most of human history, hundreds of thousands of years, people did not build cities. They did not even build permanent villages. They lived in small groups and moved around, following animals they hunted and plants they could gather. They were what we call hunter-gatherers. They had fire, they had tools, they had language and culture and art, but they did not settle in one place permanently. Then, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. People began to settle down. They began farming, planting crops and raising animals. And when you farm, you need to stay in one place for the growing season. You build shelter, you store food, you store to accumulate things, and small settlements begin to grow. Çatalhöyük is one of the earliest and largest of these early settlements in the world. It was a place where thousands of people lived in closely packed mud brick houses between approximately 7500 BCE and 5700 BCE. That is a period of nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation, starting 9,500 years ago. This is not ancient Rome or ancient Greece. This is so much older that it makes Rome look recent. The site is located on a flat plain in central Turkey, in an area called the Cahokia Plain. To look at it today, you see two mounds of earth rising from the flat landscape. These mounds are what archaeologists call tells accumulations of human debris that have built up over centuries of habitation. When people lived at Çatalhöyük, they built their mud brick houses, and when those houses crumbled, they built new ones on top of the ruins. Over generations, this created a mound that grew higher and higher. The east mound, which is the older and larger of the two, rises about 21 meters above the surrounding plain. Çatalhöyük was discovered in the late 1950s and excavated beginning in the 1960s by a British archaeologist named James Mullard. His findings were sensational. Inside the mud brick houses, he found wall paintings, paintings of animals, of hunting scenes, of geometric patterns made by people nearly 8,000 years ago. He found small sculptures, including figurines of women that some researchers believe represent a goddess or spiritual figure. He found the remains of people buried directly under the floors of their homes, not in separate cemeteries, but right there in the living spaces. The society at Çatalhöyük was unusual in several ways. There seemed to have been very few differences in status between people. Archaeologists have not found the kind of large, grand building that usually indicate a ruling class or a wealthy elite. The houses were all roughly similar in size. People entered their homes through holes in the roof rather than through doors in the walls. The whole settlement was built so closely together that there were essentially no streets between the houses. You had to climb up onto the roof and then down through a hole to get inside. The people of Çatalhöyük kept cattle, sheep, and goats. They grew wheat and barley. They hunted wild animals, deer, boar, leopard. They made tools from obsidian, a black volcanic glass that was sharp enough to cut and that came from a source some distance away, which tells us they were trading with or traveling to other regions. For nearly 2,000 years, this community thrived. Then, around 5700 BCE, they abandoned the site. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps the land became less fertile. Perhaps there was some other reason we have not discovered. But they left, and the mounds were slowly buried by wind-blown soil, and for thousands of years the site was just two humps in a flat Turkish plain with no one knowing what lay inside them. Today, Çatalhöyük is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most intensively studied prehistoric sites in the world. Archaeologists from around the globe have worked there for decades. The ongoing excavations continue to reveal new things about how these very early settled humans lived, what they ate, how they treated illness, how they organized their society, what they believed about the world. The reason Çatalhöyük matters so much is that it helps us understand the birth of civilization itself. It is not the oldest settlement ever found, but it is one of the earliest places where thousands of people chose to live together in permanent structures with a shared culture. Everything that came after, the cities, the states, the empires, the world we live in today, builds on what began in places like Çatalhöyük. This one is different from the others because the ancient city and the modern city share the same name. Alexandria in Egypt was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, and Alexandria today is still a major city, Egypt's second largest, home to millions of people. The ancient city was founded in 331 BCE by Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered a vast stretch of the world in a very short time. After his death, Egypt was ruled by a dynasty called the Ptolemies, and they made Alexandria their capital. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the most important city in the ancient world, more important than Rome for a time, certainly the most important center of learning and culture. The city had the famous Library of Alexandria, which was an attempt to collect all the knowledge of the world in one place, to gather every book ever written in every language, and store it in one enormous institution. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean world to study there. The library was associated with a place called the Museum. The word means House of the Musen, the goddesses of knowledge and art, where researchers did what we might today call scientific work. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, philosophy, all were pursued there. Alexandria also had the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was an enormous lighthouse standing on a small island called Pharos, connected to the mainland by a causeway. Ancient sources describe it as one of the tallest structures ever built by humans at that time, possibly somewhere between 100 and 130 meters tall. It guided ships safely into the harbor of Alexandria for many centuries. So where is all of this now? Much of ancient Alexandria is underwater. The harbor of Alexandria has shifted over the centuries. Earthquakes and subsidence, the gradual sinking of land, have caused large portions of the ancient city to slip beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea. Underwater archaeologists have spent decades exploring the ancient harbor and have found spectacular things. Enormous blocks of stone, statues, sphinxes, foundations of ancient buildings, all resting on the floor of the harbor, beneath the blue water. The island of Pharos, where the lighthouse stood, is now a peninsula. The land has changed that much. The lighthouse itself no longer exists. It was damaged by earthquakes over the centuries, and in the 14th century CE, the Mamluk Sultan Cahokia built a fortress on the site using stones from the ruined lighthouse. That fortress, the citadel of Cahokia, still stands today, But ancient Alexandria is not only underwater. Beneath the modern city, there are also extensive remains. Whenever construction crews in Alexandria dig foundations for new buildings, they often hit ancient structures. There are catacombs, underground burial chambers that date to the Roman period and were discovered accidentally when a donkey fell through the ground into them in 1900. The catacombs of Kom el-Shokafa are now open to visitors and are one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Egypt that most people have never heard of. There is also the question of what happened to the library. No one knows exactly when or how it was destroyed. There was not one single catastrophic fire on one specific day, as popular stories often suggest. Instead, the library seems to have declined gradually over centuries through a combination of fires, political neglect, funding cuts, and the general collapse of the ancient world it was part of. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt happened in 642 CE, the library as an institution had probably been gone for a long time. But where were all the books? Where are the physical remains of that place? This is one of archaeology's great unanswered questions. Some researchers believe that significant portions of the ancient city, including possibly the site of the library, remain buried beneath the dense urban fabric of modern Alexandria, inaccessible because there is a living city sitting on top of everything. Alexandria teaches us something poignant. The very success of a place, its continuous importance through history, can be what makes it hardest to study archaeologically. Because people never stopped living and building there, each generation's construction disturbed and buried the previous one. Now we cross the Atlantic and come to North America, to a place that most Americans have never heard of, but that was once the largest city north of Mexico. Cahokia was a Native American city located in what is now the state of Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, Missouri, at its peak around 1100 CE. Roughly 900 years ago, Cahokia had a population that archaeologists estimate at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Some estimates go higher. By any measure, it was enormous for its time and place. The civilization that built Cahokia is called the Mississippian culture by archaeologists. The Mississippian people were farmers who grew corn as their primary crop, and they built large, complex settlements throughout the Mississippi River Valley and surrounding regions. Cahokia was the largest and most important of these settlements. The most visible feature of Cahokia, and the thing that makes it clearly not just a village, a genuine city, is the enormous earthen mounds that the people there built. These are not natural hills. They are constructed mounds of earth, piled up deliberately by human labor over many generations, used as platforms for important building and as a basis for ceremonies and rituals. The largest of these mounds is called Monk's Mound. It covers an area of about 5 hectares, about the size of a dozen American football fields placed together, and rises about 30 meters in height. It is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas. At the top of Monk's Mound, the people of Cahokia built a large wooden structure, probably a temple or a chief's residence, that stood overlooking the entire city. Around Monk's Mound was a large open plaza, and around that, spreading out for several kilometers in every direction, were the neighborhoods of the city, clusters of smaller mounds, wooden buildings, storage areas, workshops, and the homes of ordinary people. The city was surrounded by a wooden stockade, a defensive wall made of wooden posts that enclosed the central area. Then, starting around 1200 CE, Cahokia began to decline. By around 1350 CE, the city was essentially abandoned. No one knows exactly why. Possible reasons include overhunting of local wildlife, deforestation that led to soil erosion, flooding from the Mississippi River, drought, political instability, or some combination of all of these. Whatever the reason, by the time European explorers began arriving in North America, Cahokia had been empty for a very long time. The forests had grown back. The mounds were still there, but they looked like natural hills unless you knew what to look for. French explorers who came through the area in the 17th century noticed the mounds but did not understand them. The name Cahokia comes from a tribe called the Cahokia people who were living in the area at that time, but they were not descendants of the city's builders and had nothing to do with the original civilization. As European American settlement expanded westward in the 19th century, people began building on the site. The St. Louis metropolitan area grew up around and over Cahokia. Many of the smaller mounds were destroyed during this development. Some were leveled for farmland, some had houses built on top of them, some were excavated for the clay and soil inside them. which was used in construction. What survives today is a protected area called Cahokia Mound State Historic Site, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. About 80 mounds survive within the protected area out of the original 120 or more. Monk's Mound is still standing and is open to the public. You can climb it and stand at the top and scout over the surrounding landscape. Though today what you see is not an ancient city but suburban St. Louis. Around the edges of the protected site, the modern world presses in. There are highways running through and around the site. There are strip malls and fast food restaurants and subdivisions. Some of the mounds that were not protected have houses on top of them. You can drive through the surrounding suburbs and not realize that beneath you, and sometimes literally in your neighbor's backyard, there are the remains of the largest city in pre-Columbian North America. Cahokia forces a reckoning with a common misconception about North American history: the idea that the continent was essentially empty before European settlers arrived, populated only by small nomadic tribes. Cahokia proves that is completely wrong. This was a major city, a center of trade and culture and political power 900 years ago, right in the middle of what is now the American heartland. Carthage was one of the greatest powers of the ancient Mediterranean world. At its height, it controlled a trading empire that stretched across North Africa, through Spain and Sardinia and Sicily, and touched much of the known world. For centuries, Carthage and Rome were bitter rivals, fighting three devastating wars, the Punic Wars, for control of the Mediterranean. The city was founded by Phoenician settlers, traders and sailors from what is now Lebanon, somewhere around 814 BCE, though the exact date is disputed. They chose a location on a peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of Tunis, in what is now northern Tunisia. The location was excellent, surrounded by water on three sides with two natural harbors, positioned at a crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes. Carthage grew rich on trade. It had a powerful navy and controlled key sea routes. It built up alliances and colonies across the western Mediterranean, and it produced extraordinary leaders, the most famous being Hannibal Barca, who famously marched an army across the Alps to attack Rome directly from the north. This was one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. But ultimately, Carthage lost. In 146 BCE, after the Third Punic War, Roman forces under the general Scipio Aemilianus captured the city. What happened next became legendary, and also somewhat exaggerated in later retellings. Rome did not literally plow the land with salt, as the popular story goes. They did completely demolish the city. They knocked down the buildings, they destroyed the walls, they sent the population into slavery. They left the site essentially flattened, and then, about 100 years later, the Romans built a new city on the same spot. Julius Caesar ordered a new colony at Carthage, and Augustus later expanded it. Roman Carthage became one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, a center of North African trade and culture. Early Christianity had a particularly strong presence there. Some of the most important early Christian thinkers, including Tertullian and St. Augustine, who was not from Carthage itself but spent significant time there, were associated with the region. Eventually, Roman Carthage too declined. The city was captured by the Vandals, a Germanic people, in 439 CE, then reconquered by the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to Rome, in 533 CE, and finally captured by the Arab Muslim forces in 698 CE. The Arab conquerors essentially abandoned Carthage and built a new capital nearby, which became the city of Tunis. So today, the ruins of Carthage, both the Phoenician original and the later Roman city, lie within the suburbs of modern Tunis. The Tunis metropolitan area has grown up around and over the ancient. Wealthy Tunisian families have built villas there. There are hotels and apartment buildings. The coastal area, which would have been the ancient harbor district, is now a residential neighborhood. Within this urban sprawl, there are archaeological sites. You can visit the ruins of Roman baths that were once the largest outside of Rome itself. You can see the remains of a Roman amphitheater. You can visit the Tophet, the site of a Phoenician sacred area that has been at the center of a long debate about whether the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice. The evidence is complex and contested among archaeologists. Much of ancient Carthage is inaccessible because it is under the modern city, and what has been excavated has sometimes been studied in difficult conditions, squeezed between modern buildings and roads. The layers of Phoenician Carthage are often deep underground, below the Roman layers on top, and reaching them requires careful, expensive, time-consuming work. What is particularly striking about Carthage is the near total absence of written records from the Carthaginians themselves. The Romans destroyed not just the city, but most of its literature and records. Almost everything we know about Carthage comes from Roman and Greek sources. And those sources were written by people who were at war with Carthage, which means they were not exactly objective. Archaeology is essential for understanding Carthage because the written record is so biased and so incomplete. Every new excavation adds something to a picture that we are still only beginning to assemble. You know Pompeii, but you may not know about Stabiae, an ancient Roman resort town that was also destroyed in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. And that lies beneath a modern Italian city. Stabiae was not a major city in the Roman world. It was something more like a luxury resort destination, a place where wealthy Romans built enormous seaside villas to escape the heat of the summer and enjoy the views of the Bay of Naples. Ancient sources describe it as a place of beautiful gardens, sea breezes, and grand architecture. The Roman author Pliny the Elder was actually at Stabiae when Vesuvius erupted. He was the commander of the Roman fleet at nearby Misenum, and when the eruption began, he sailed toward the volcano. Partly out of scientific curiosity, he was a naturalist who had written extensively about the natural world, and partly to rescue people trapped by the eruption. He made it to Stabiae, where he stayed with a friend, but the conditions there were dangerous. Falling ash and rocks, poisonous gases, darkness. Pliny the Elder died at Stabiae during the eruption. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, who stayed behind at Misenum, wrote detailed letters describing what he had seen, letters that have survived to this day, and are among the most vivid first-hand accounts of a natural disaster from the ancient world. The villas of Stabiae were buried under volcanic deposits, similar to Herculaneum, though not quite as deep. During the 18th century, the King of Naples ordered excavations in the area, and workers uncovered astonishing wall paintings and mosaic floors in the ancient villas. But instead of leaving the excavations open and studying them properly, the workers simply extracted the portable treasures, paintings, statues, decorative objects, and then reburied the sites. This was archaeology of a very different and destructive kind from what we practice today. The site was then largely forgotten again, covered by the growth of the modern town of Castellamare di Stabia. Modern roads, buildings, and infrastructure were built on top of it. Today, the villas of Stabiae are partially accessible. Some ongoing excavation work has been done in recent years, and there are efforts to make the site more accessible to visitors, but a significant portion of the ancient resort town remains buried beneath the modern city. What makes Stabiae particularly interesting is the scale and quality of the architecture. These were not ordinary Roman houses. They were enormous complexes covering thousands of square meters, with multiple levels, elaborate garden terraces, spectacular views of the bay, and some of the finest wall paintings in the Roman world. The paintings depict landscapes, architectural scenes, mythological subjects, and portrait figures with a quality and creativity that rivals anything found at Pompeii. Stabiae reminds us that it is not only famous monumental cities that get buried. Smaller, more intimate places, resorts, villages, farms, were swallowed by the same disasters and the same passage of time, and they tell us just as much about how people actually lived. Most people have heard of Petra, the ancient city carved into red sandstone cliffs in the desert of what is now southern Jordan. It is famous, one of the new 7 wonders of the world, as voted by the public in 2007. Millions of tourists have walked through the narrow canyon called the Se, emerged to see the magnificent facade of the treasury carved directly into the cliff face. But what many visitors do not know is that the Petra they see, the carved facades, the tombs cut into the cliffs, is really just the surface. Beneath the ground in the central city basin of Petra, there is an entire buried city that most tourists walk right over without knowing it is there. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, an ancient Arab trading civilization that controlled key caravan routes through the desert. The Nabateans were extraordinarily skilled engineers and water managers. In a desert environment with almost no rainfall, they built an elaborate system of dams, channels, cisterns, and pipes to collect and distribute every drop of water that fell or could be channeled into their city. This water management system is one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. At its peak, around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, Petra had a population of somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. The city had temples, a colonnaded street, a large theater, a marketplace, baths, a large civic building called the Great Temple, residential neighborhood, and all the infrastructure of a prosperous urban civilization. The carved facades in the cliffs, what most tourists come to see, were primarily tombs and ceremonial structures. The actual living city was in the basin below, built from stone and mud brick. And that living city has been buried under meters of accumulated sediment over the centuries since Petra declined and was abandoned. Petra's decline began after the Roman Empire absorbed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE. The Romans redirected trade routes, which undercut Petra's economic base. Earthquakes damaged the city, particularly a massive earthquake in 363 CE that caused widespread destruction. Gradually, the population dwindled. By the Byzantine period, Petra was still inhabited, but much reduced. The early medieval period, it was largely abandoned. What happened to the buildings of the central city basin? They collapsed, and over centuries, layers of windblown sand and debris accumulated on top of them. The area became flat-looking, just a broad sandy basin between dramatic cliff walls. In 1993, archaeologists working in Petra used a technique called ground-penetrating radar, a device that sends signals into the ground and can detect structures underneath without digging, and found something extraordinary. Beneath the surface of the central basin, they detected the remains of an enormous buried building complex. Further investigation revealed it was a massive monument aligned with important astronomical events, larger than any structure visible on the surface of Petra. This buried monument has since been identified through satellite imagery and remote sensing as a ceremonial complex of remarkable scale, larger than the visible treasury. That is Petra's most famous image. It has never been fully excavated, partly because of the expense and the complexity of excavation in the desert environment, and partly because what is above ground already requires so much attention and conservation. Beyond this specific discovery, there are extensive buried remains throughout the central basin at Petra. The colonnaded street, the Great Temple, and other major monuments were partially excavated in the 20th century, but the surrounding residential areas and many civic buildings remain underground. Each excavation season, archaeologists find new structures, new artifacts, new evidence of how this city actually functioned on a day-to-day level. The experience of visiting Petra is one of walking on top of an invisible city. Ground beneath your feet as you walk between the visible monuments contains the homes, workshops, markets, and streets of 30,000 ancient people. The dramatic cliffs are only half the story, the other half is underground. This is perhaps the most mysterious of all the cities we are discussing today, because we still cannot read the writing they left behind. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, was one of the first great urban civilizations in human history, alongside those of Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and ancient Egypt. It flourished roughly between 3300 BCE and 1300 BCE in an area covering what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. At its peak, around 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization had a population of perhaps 5 million people, making it larger than either Egypt or Mesopotamia at the same time. This civilization built cities, not small settlements, but proper planned cities with streets laid out in grids, multi-story buildings made of fired mud brick, sophisticated drainage and sewage systems, public baths, warehouses, and all the features of genuine urban life. The largest of these cities was Mohenjo-daro, located in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan. At its peak, Mohenjo-daro probably had a population of between 40,000 and 80,000 people. It covered an area of about 250 hectares. The city was laid out in two main sections: a raised citadel area on a western mound, where important public buildings were located, and a lower city to the east, where most of the population lived. The buildings at Mohenjo-daro were made of standardized, baked mud bricks. The same dimensions were used consistently throughout the city, and indeed throughout the entire Indus Valley civilization across hundreds of kilometers. This standardization of bricks suggests a high level of central organization and planning. The streets were laid out in a grid, with wider main streets and narrower lanes running between blocks of houses. Drainage system is particularly remarkable. Almost every house had a private toilet and bathroom that drained into covered sewers running beneath the streets. These sewers collected waste and channeled it out of the city. Nothing like this level of urban sanitation would exist again in the world for thousands of years. By comparison, Medieval European cities more than 3,000 years later had far inferior waste management. There was a large public bath, sometimes called the Great Bath, in the Citadel area. It was a carefully waterproof tank made of brick and sealed with natural tar to make it watertight, surrounded by galleries and rooms. Its exact purpose is not certain. It may have been used for ritual purification or for public bathing, but here is the profound mystery. We cannot read the Indus Valley script. The people of this civilization left behind thousands of small inscribed seals. Small square stones, usually about 2 to 4 centimeters across, carved with images of animals and other figures and with rows of symbols that represent a writing system. This writing has never been deciphered. Because we cannot read their language, we know almost nothing about the social and political structure of the Indus Valley civilization. We do not know the names of any of their leaders or whether they even had kings. We do not know the names of their gods. We do not know what they called their cities. We do not know what they called themselves. Everything we know about them comes purely from the physical evidence, the objects, the buildings, the city plans that archaeology has uncovered. And then around 1900 BCE, the civilization began to decline. By 1300 BCE, the major cities were abandoned. The reasons are debated. Climate change and the drying up of rivers, shifts in monsoon patterns, flooding, possibly migration, possibly some combination of factors. The cities were gradually buried under layers of silt from the Indus River and its tributaries, and eventually under wind-blown dust. Mohenjo-daro was rediscovered in the 1920s, when archaeologists working in the area found artifacts and began investigating the mound. That turned out to be the buried city. Excavation revealed the extraordinary civilization described above, but the site is now under severe threat. The preserved mud brick structures are being damaged by rising groundwater and salt deposits, which are dissolving the ancient bricks. Climate change is accelerating this damage. UNESCO has listed Mohenjo-daro as one of the most endangered World Heritage Sites in the world. Much of the site has not been excavated. The known city extends well beyond the areas that have been uncovered. There may be large sections that have not yet been found. The surrounding landscape of flat Pakistani plains gives no indication that beneath it, scattered across an area the size of Western Europe, are the remains of one of humanity's great early civilizations. The Indus Valley civilization is a reminder of how much of human history has been lost. Not just buried underground, but lost in the deeper sense that we cannot yet understand it. The people of Mohenjo-daro lived complex, sophisticated lives, and they had a written language to record those lives. But we have not yet broken the code. The ruins speak to us, but in a language we do not yet understand. For our final city, we come to the most layered place on Earth, Rome. Rome is unique in the world because it is a modern city of nearly 3 million people that has been continuously inhabited for almost 3,000 years. Unlike places that were abandoned and buried, Rome was never deserted. People kept living there, kept building there, kept tearing things down and constructing new things for 30 centuries without interruption. And the result is a city that contains more archaeological layers than perhaps any other place on the planet. Let us start with the basics of Rome's history, because it covers such a long span that it can be hard to grasp. The traditional date for the founding of Rome is 753 BCE, though archaeologists have found evidence of human habitation on the seven hills of Rome going back much further, perhaps to 1000 BCE or even earlier. In the early centuries, Rome was a small city-state, ruled first by kings, then by a republic, a form of government where elected officials made decisions. Over time, Rome conquered more and more of Italy, then the Mediterranean world. By the time of the Roman Empire, which began around 27 BCE when the first emperor Augustus took power, Rome was the capital of a domain that stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. The population of the city of Rome at its peak in the 2nd century CE was probably over 1 million people. It was the largest city in the Western world, and it would not be surpassed in size by any European city for more than 1,000 years. The physical city of ancient Rome was extraordinary. The Roman Forum, the central public square, was surrounded by temples, government buildings, monuments, and archives. The Colosseum, an amphitheater that could seat 50,000 or more spectators, hosted gladiatorial games and public spectacles. The Circus Maximus was an enormous chariot racing stadium that could hold up to 250,000 spectators, the largest sports venue the world has ever seen. There were dozens of temples, enormous public baths. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. Aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant mountains, warehouses lining the river, and dense residential neighborhoods filling every space between the monuments. Then the empire declined. The city was sacked by the Visigoths in 410 CE and by the Vandals in 455 CE. The population collapsed from perhaps 1 million people at the peak to perhaps 30,000 by the 6th century CE. The aqueducts that supplied water were cut or fell into disrepair. The great monuments deteriorated. Marble was stripped from buildings and burned to make lime for mortar or reused in new construction. The temples became churches or were dismantled for building material. And as the population declined and buildings fell, the ground level of Rome rose. The debris of fallen structures accumulated. Flooding from the Tiber River deposited silt. For centuries, the ancient Roman ground level was buried under meters of new. The Roman Forum, which in ancient times was a gleaming open plaza surrounded by marble temples, became a medieval cow pasture called the Campo Vaccino, the field of cows, because it was just a grassy open area with a few broken columns sticking out of the ground. Medieval Rome was built on top of ancient Rome. Then Renaissance Rome was built on top of medieval Rome. Then Baroque Rome on top of that. Then modern Rome on top of all of it. Today, the ancient ground level, the level where Romans walked, where Caesar was assassinated, where Cicero gave his speeches, is typically somewhere between 3 and 10 meters below the modern street. In some parts of the city, it is even deeper. When construction workers dig foundations for new buildings in Rome, they almost always find ancient structures, and work must halt while archaeologists assess what has been found. This happens so frequently that there is a dedicated branch of Roman archaeology focused specifically on managing these rescue excavations. The visible monuments, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, are only a fraction of what ancient Rome contained. Beneath the modern streets, there are Roman roads that have not seen daylight in 1,600 years. There are the foundations of temples whose names we know from ancient texts, but whose physical remains have never been excavated. There are the basements and sublevels of ancient buildings whose upper stories are long gone. There are stretches of the ancient city that have simply never been explored because there is a functioning modern city sitting on top of them. In recent decades, technology has helped. Ground-penetrating radar, used to scan beneath the streets without excavating, has revealed astonishing things. In the area under what is now a car park near the Circus Maximus, scanning revealed the remains of what appeared to be a large rectangular structure that archaeologists believe may be connected to ancient Roman building programs they had not previously identified. Under the modern streets of the Campo Marzio neighborhood, the ancient Field of Mars, there are the remains of enormous ancient buildings, stadiums, theaters, temples, and gardens, all hidden beneath the apartment blocks and restaurants and hotels above. The experience of being in modern Rome is the experience of living inside a palimpsest, which is a word that means a manuscript that has been written on, erased, and written on again, so that traces of earlier writing still show through. Rome is a palimpsest in stone and soil. You walk past an ancient Roman wall that has been incorporated into a medieval building that was remodeled in the Renaissance and now has a modern shopfront at the ground level. These layers are everywhere, visible if you know how to look. The Vatican museums contain an entire floor below the main galleries, where you can walk through the ancient Roman necropolis, the city of the dead that existed under what was once the Circus of Nero. It was beneath the apse of St. Peter's Basilica, hidden for 1,600 years, until excavations in the 1940s revealed it. A street of Roman tombs, some pagan, some early Christian, with mosaic ceilings and painted walls, preserved underground while all of Christianity built up above them. Beneath St. Peter's Square, which every tourist crosses to enter the basilica, the obelisk standing in the center was brought from Egypt by the Emperor Caligula and stood in the circus where early Christians were executed. It is the only ancient Roman obelisk in Rome that was never toppled and has stood continuously in Rome since the 1st century CE. Everything around it has been torn down, rebuilt, transformed, But the obelisk has stood through all of it, witnessing 30 centuries of human history in one place. Rome is the ultimate example of a city buried beneath itself. It did not need a volcano or an invader to bury it. Time and the weight of its own continued existence buried the ancient city. Layer by layer, generation by generation, the city that ruled the world sank beneath the city that replaced it, and that city sank beneath the city that replaced that one, all the way down to where we are today, walking on ancient history without always knowing it. What all of these cities tell US 10 cities, different continents, different cultures, different times. Some were buried by volcanoes, some by floods, some by gradual accumulation, some by their own continued occupation, but they all share something important. They are all evidence that human civilization is deeper than we think, deeper in time and deeper in the literal sense, deeper in the ground. When we talk about history, we often talk about it as something that happened somewhere else, somewhere far away, in some distant and barely imaginable time. But these 10 cities prove that history is not somewhere else. It is right here. It is under the road you drove to work on this morning. It is under the field you pass on the train. It is under the city center where you shop on weekends. The people who built these cities were not so different from us. They wanted safe places to live, enough food to eat, clean water to drink, wanted to trade with their neighbors and accumulate some comfort and beauty in their lives. They built temples and theaters and markets and baths. They raised children and buried their dead. They had conflicts and made art and solved problems. And then something happened. War, disaster, climate change, economic collapse, political failure, and the cities fell. And time buried them. And we forgot they were ever there. Until someone started digging. The work of archaeology, of carefully and patiently uncovering what time has buried, is one of the most important things humanity does, because it is the work of recovering our own memory. Every city we unearth, every inscription we decipher, every ancient street we walk again, is an act of remembering. It is an act of saying, these people existed, their lives mattered, what they built mattered, and the work is far from over. The vast majority of what has been buried has not yet been found, or has been found but not yet studied. Technology for investigating buried sites. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning from aircraft, DNA analysis of ancient human remains is advancing rapidly. In the next few decades, we will almost certainly make discoveries that rewrite major chapters of human history. But there is also something urgent about this work. Every year that passes, the ancient cities buried beneath modern ones are under greater threat. Urban expansion means more construction. And more construction means more opportunities for ancient remains to be destroyed before they are ever properly studied. Every time a developer pours a foundation for a new apartment block, there is a chance that something irreplaceable is being crushed or covered permanently. This is why the laws that require construction crews to stop and notify archaeologists when they find ancient remains are so important. In Italy, for example, the law says that if you are digging and you find something ancient, you must stop work and report it. The same kind of laws exist in Turkey, in Egypt, in Jordan, in many countries that sit on top of the richest archaeological ground in the world. These laws are sometimes inconvenient for developers. They can delay projects and add costs, but they exist because the alternative, letting ancient history be bulldozed and paved over without any record being made, is a loss that cannot be undone. Climate change is also a growing threat to buried cities. Rising groundwater levels, caused partly by over-extraction of water from underground aquifers and partly by rising sea levels, are saturating ancient mud brick structures that have been stable for thousands of years. This salt that dissolves in groundwater crystallizes inside the bricks as the water evaporates, and this crystallization physically pushes the brick apart, destroying it from the inside. This is what is happening at Mohenjo-daro. It is also a problem at many sites in the Middle East and North Africa. Sites that survived intact for 4,000 years are now crumbling within decades because the hydrological conditions around them have changed. Rising sea levels are threatening coastal sites like ancient Alexandria, where underwater remains that have been stable for centuries are being moved and disturbed by storm surges and changing sea conditions. The ancient harbor structures, the statues, the building foundations on the seafloor, all of these are increasingly vulnerable. Despite all of this, There is reason for optimism. Technology is giving archaeologists tools they never had before. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is a technique where a laser scanner is mounted on an airplane or a drone and fires millions of laser pulses at the ground per second. The pulses bounce back, and the data creates an incredibly precise three-dimensional map of the ground's surface. In dense jungle, LiDAR can penetrate through the tree canopy and map the ground beneath, revealing features that are invisible from the surface. This technology has been used to discover entire ancient cities in the jungles of Central America, cities of the Maya civilization that were completely hidden from view by vegetation. Satellite imagery from space has also transformed archaeology. High-resolution satellite cameras can detect subtle differences in vegetation growth patterns or soil color that indicate buried structures below. Ancient walls absorb and release moisture differently than the surrounding soil, which means that crops growing above them grow slightly differently, and from space, these patterns are sometimes visible. This technique, which has been used since the early days of aerial photography, is now far more powerful with modern satellite technology. Ground-penetrating radar, which we mentioned in relation to Petra, is being used at more and more sites around the world. It can detect the outlines of buried walls, floors, and objects without any digging at all, allowing archaeologists to map a buried city before deciding where to excavate. This means that excavation can be targeted much more precisely, reducing the amount of soil that needs to be removed and the potential for accidental damage. DNA analysis of ancient human remains has added another dimension entirely by extracting and analyzing DNA from the bones of ancient people, sometimes people who lived 3, 4, even 5,000 years ago. Scientists can now learn where those people came from, who they were related to, whether they were migrants or long-time residents, and what diseases they carried. When this genetic data is combined with archaeological findings from the same sites, the picture of how ancient cities were populated and repopulated becomes much clearer. All of this means that we are living through a golden age of archaeological discovery. Despite the threats, despite the challenges, despite the buried cities still waiting under modern ones, we are uncovering the past at a pace that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. And what we are finding again and again is that the past was more complex, more sophisticated, more interconnected, and more human than we previously understood. Troy was not just a myth. Cahokia was not just a mound of dirt. Mohenjo-daro was not a primitive village. These are places where people thought and built and organized and created, and where they grappled with the same basic challenges of life we still grapple with today. There's something deeply moving about standing over a buried city. You are standing on the ceiling of someone's house. The people who lived below you had names and families and opinions about their neighbors. They had favorite foods and least favorite days, and things they were proud of and things they regretted. They lived entire lives in the space beneath your feet, and then time buried them, and now you walk above them without even knowing they are there. Archaeology is the practice of listening, of getting quiet enough, patient enough, careful enough to hear what the ground is saying. The ground is always talking. It holds everything we have ever built, everything we have ever thrown away, every bone of every person who ever lived on it. All of it is still there, in layers, waiting to be read. The 10 cities we discussed today are 10 of the most remarkable chapters in that underground library. But there are thousands more. Across every continent, in every country, the ground holds its secrets. And every year, in small increments and occasionally in dramatic leaps, we get closer to knowing what those secrets are. Somewhere under the ground right now, there are cities we have not yet found. There are streets that have not seen daylight in 1,000 years. There are inscriptions that will tell us things we currently have no idea we do not know. The past is buried, but it is not gone. It is waiting, and the ground beneath our feet is full.